lot. He's a lovely man to work with. I think I did some civil defence films with him, black and white, and he was very good. I said, you know, shadows, I want to see black, really black shadows. I don't want any can't figure out. And he actually took me at my word, and you could hardly see anything at all, remember. So he's a wonderful cameraman. And he did a flying film for me. I was asked by Ronnie Riley to do a film on the Hunter Jet trainer, which we did down at Dunsfold. And Peter was all for doing this. He was a bit of a lad. And we had a sea fury to film from, which he went up in. And got some lovely stuff with the Hunter Jet trainer, peeling off to do various things. And then, of course, he actually had to go up in the Hunter Jet trainer with Bill Bedford, who was the chief Porter test pilot, to do some high-speed stuff and rolls and instruments and all that stuff. And unfortunately, Peter had had lunch before he went up. And I can remember him going to meet him as he climbed out of the cockpit. And he took his oxygen mask off, and there was tomato and lettuce.
Yeah.
All his lunch there.
Yeah, all his lunch.
And Bill Bedford looked at me, his eyes went to heaven, and said, "No more lunch for Peter if we're filming." No, he was lovely. I did a lot of work with Peter. And lovely man. And somebody would be interested. Freddie Francis. I worked once with Freddie Francis.
Oh, really? Oh, right. Yeah. Did you?
Yes, I did a commercial for Highland Spring water, and we did this up at beyond Perth, and I'd never met Freddie before. Charming. It rained for 2 days and we couldn't do anything, and the advertising people were up there asking me stuff. They kept on changing the logos and all that stuff. The stuff would be sent back at night and come up by air first thing in the morning. This is on the bottles.
Yeah.
And it's very all we had to do was shots of, we had some tame golden eagles. We had to do shots of them flying, and then we had to do a kind of pack shot of bottles of Highland Spring water and glasses with Highland Spring water in them. And we scrambled all these. I think we were allowed 3 days in which to do the whole thing. We'd lost 2 days because of rain. We scrambled all this stuff together in the last half day, I think, practically. And Freddie was wonderful to be with, I must say, very relaxed and easy. And the pack shot had to be reshot because the water had taken on the colour of the heather behind, and nobody had noticed. It looked as though somebody had peed in it.
Yeah.
And that was reshot in the studio. I thought Freddie should have actually noticed. I should have noticed probably as well.
So you did quite a few commercials, did you, over a period of time?
I did. Not actually. Quite a good story. When I was doing the pilot for the Klondike series up at Anuvik, as people do, somebody rang me from England thinking it was normal time. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, saying, "David, when does it start freezing over in the Arctic? And where's the easiest place you can get to film in the Arctic?" I'm saying, how soon could that be? So I said, "Look, I'm meant to be filming in a couple of hours' time. Call me back at our time, this evening." So I made some inquiries in the meantime, and I found that at a place called Igloolik, you could get in there by air, and there would be pack ice by October, beginning of October. And the guy explained that he wanted to do some scenes for a commercial for Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry. All the interiors would be done in England later, but he needed some shots of a dog sled and dog team and a couple of mushers coming through the pack ice and then coming up, stopping, and then seeing a mound of snow with a bit of a chimney poking out of it and smoke coming out of it. And then continuing on towards the mound of snow. And it seemed rather bizarre to go to this place called Igloolik, which was absolutely Eskimo, no alcohol whatsoever there, to do a film, commercial for Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry. But anyhow, we did it. And the stuff in England, which I wasn't involved with, was an enormous great set with a balcony, and the two explorers come out onto the balcony, and the balcony goes down to ground level, and it was based actually on the big room which I used to have at Schoolhouse in North Creek. And then they go over to the fireplace. There's a cracking great fire going. There's a big tray of drinks there, and they pour each other drinks and say Merry Christmas to each other. And one of the guys says, and what should we tell them back home? And the other one says, what a cracking good way to spend Christmas. And they drink the Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry. At that moment there's a great rattling in the chimney and a great pile of soot comes down, and you imagine that Father Christmas is going to come down. And it cost an absolute fortune. I just couldn't believe it. You know, people came out from England, designers and advertising executives. They all had to be kitted out with the right kind of gear, and all flown up to this place in Gludic, where we were there. I think we were there 2 days, and I know that I was paid in cash for it, and I took it back at the bottom of my suitcase. Fearful it might be discovered by a customer or something like that.
God, yeah. Tell me, you were going to talk about Duncan Cass and working with him.
Oh yes.
On a particular film project.
I worked with Duncan on Goshawk, and then in 1976, Duncan had persuaded the BBC that we should do a film about British Antarctic Survey, which is about the boats that go down and replenish the various bases in the Antarctic. The BBC weren't terribly interested in that, but they said, is there anything else you can do at the same time when you're down there? And I said, yes, Duncan's survival story is very, very interesting, and that would make a very good little 50-minute film, just on Duncan on his own.
He deliberately went there on his own, didn't he?
Yes, he went there after one of his marriage breakups, and his ambition was to spend 2 years there, doing Met readings, counting penguins, doing all that kind of survey work at a place called Undine South Harbour in South Georgia, which is exactly where Shackleton landed with his boat party.
Oh yeah.
It's a fairly it's under these towering great mountains. I mean, they are enormous, the mountains in the Antarctic, but it is a sheltered little harbour, and so I scripted this, having talked to Duncan, and we would be put off from the John Biscoe, the British Antarctic ship, for 4 days. Very crucial that we just had 4 days in which to shoot 50 minutes.
Oh, I see, yes. That's interesting.
Which is a bit of a task. We live in tents, and we had to tell Duncan's story. Now, he was very, very good at talking to camera. And he managed to, during the time there, he managed to tell the whole story beautifully. And then it started to snow, and the people on the John Biscoe were scared that they weren't going to be able to pick it up, so we had to be ready, and Duncan was scared that he was going to be marooned again, and eventually we picked up all right. I mean, the story really was that he was there for 2 years. He'd only been there about 6 weeks. The Navy had dropped him off with a hut in kit form, which he had to put up. He'd only been there 6 weeks. He was lying in his bunk one day. He'd hear the sea breaking on the shore, and suddenly he heard a much bigger roar on the shore than he thought was natural, and the next thing that he knew was the hut had been hit, and it was being washed right up the cove to crash at the head of the cove, splintered all round him, and he was standing in brash, ice brash and water, just in his long johns.
Was it a tsunami?
It was a tsunami, yeah. It was a tsunami, yeah. And we recreated that at Ealing. We built the hut, and we had these two enormous great tanks on axles, and on a queue. They both threw hundreds of tons of water all over Duncan, who was in his bath. It was very spectacular.
Were you shooting on 16 of this or?
16, yeah. And anyhow, he managed to survive, he says, because one of the first things he found was a case of a dozen bottles, half bottles of Burgundy. He knocked the tops off and got absolutely pissed. And he said that was the thing that kept me going. Extraordinarily, he found everything that he needed for survival. He found a spare tent, ration boxes, first aid, everything he needed, and a boat. Hadn't been washed away. And he set himself kind of periods to survive, a month at a time. And the weather was absolutely fearful. It snowed, and he had to dig himself out of his tent.
Was he able to keep in contact at all?
No,
not at all.
He knew that if he could hang on long enough, he would be rescued in the spring by the sealers, who would be bound to hit there. So he knew he had to survive. I think it was for 6 months probably. But he went slightly mad, and he invented this girl, Fran, that he used to talk to and make notes about in his diary, which I suppose kept him going. And he used to have these imaginary conversations with her. He made one attempt to get out in his rowing boat, but a leopard seal appeared, and leopard seals, a boat is prey really.
Yeah,
It started going underneath the boat backwards and forwards. He got terrified and he got back. But eventually, after 4 months, he used to go out to a lookout every day. He saw smoke on the horizon, and he was rescued. But
incredible story.
an interesting thing came out of it. When we came back to London, we did the stuff at Ealing of the tsunami hitting the hut. But he wanted to see Fran. He wanted Fran to appear in the picture. And I said, no, we shouldn't really, Duncan. He went on and on and on, and he went to Dick Corson about it and overrode me. And so soon we had these girls coming up to the East Tower block for a casting session. And Duncan said, they've got to take their top off, And so asking these girls, they mind taking their top off and showing their boobs. And eventually we selected one girl, and we shot the scene in Norfolk, because the sandhills there with the marram grass are very similar to the sandhills of marram grass at South Georgia. And so we had a rehearsal with a girl without taking her shirt off, and then we came to a take, and as she was coming forward and taking her top off, I happened to look to one side, and there was a bird watcher watching through his binoculars. And he suddenly came round. He did the biggest double take I've ever seen, as he saw this poor girl with her top off. But it was a mistake to have included her in the story. It would be much better.
Was she lost in the final edit, or was she there?
Well, Duncan argued and argued, and I argued, and I was eventually told to shut up by Richard Corson, I think it was, and don't let Duncan have his way. And I can't remember who it was.
She could have appeared in sort of
Nancy Banks, I think
couldn't
Nancy Banks Smith, or one of the critics, said it should. It was a wonderful. It's still a very good little film.
Yes, I saw it actually. I read it a long time ago. I can't
And it's
remember.
been shown several times, but I shouldn't have allowed that to happen. Really, it was wrong.
Yes, so that was exceptional.
But he was amazing. He did enormously long, 4 or 5 minute takes to camera.
He was very experienced, of course, with film, wasn't he? And he used to do the voiceovers for the national screen trailers. Did he? Endlessly. He said, I make my living out of making noises.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he would first of all been an explorer. He mapped a lot of South Georgia. He'd been Dick Barton. He was the second Dick Barton, I think.
Yes, that's what his name.
And he was also one of the first television announcers.
Oh, was he? Yes.
Yeah. He did have a lovely voice.
Yes.
Lovely voice.
I think he must. I remember bumping him.
He died about 3 years ago.
Oh, recent as that, was it? Yeah. I remember bumping into him at Lord's one day.
Oh, really?
He was sitting in the mound stand. He'd just come back from somewhere. Wanted a bit of a quiet afternoon, and there he was. Yeah, that's probably the last time I saw him.
Yeah. Now, Lisa and I went to see him a long time ago now. I always used to talk to him on the telephone. And then he had a weak heart, and he suddenly just...
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody will write a biography of him, I'm sure.
But there must be other characters that you've worked with in the past, sort of interesting.
Yes. Gerald Durrell.
Oh, really?
Yes, he was a
You
lovely
worked
man.
with him?
Yeah, a lot. Yes,
Tell me.
Yes, well, when the Goshawk came out, I had this letter from Jerry Durrell saying, I loved your film, The Goshawk, it's absolutely wonderful. I wonder if you could bring a copy of the film over to Jersey so I could show it to the staff, because I think they ought to see it. And so I went over there and met him and stayed. No, I didn't stay with him there. He put me up in a hotel. He showed the film. And he said, I'd like you to do a little film for me, David. I've got this wonderful zoo here, which is, trying to breed endangered animals and return to the wild. I've got to have a fundraising film to show in America, just only about 15 minutes. Would you do a budget for me? So I did a budget for him. And we did everything. A lot of people. John McCallum did it for nothing. I did it for nothing. And we came over and shot this film in 3 days. And he was again like Duncan. He was wonderful to camera. Absolutely brilliant. And he did a lovely opening. He had 2 young horned owls on the desk in front of him, and he had a candle burning. And he started off by saying, it's an amazing thing. We build beautiful buildings to house books, paintings, and so forth, libraries, but we do nothing about animals at all. And animals can be, you can always rebuild art galleries, libraries and so forth if they're destroyed. But animals can be destroyed just like that. And he just nipped out the the candle. And it was so dramatic, it was wonderful. Lovely, lovely man. And then he did the first treatment, because I must have been thinking about doing Tarka sometime around that. And I used to go and stay with him in the Camargue. He had a house just outside Nîmes.
Oh, right, yeah.
To go and stay with him there. And talked about lots of things he wanted to make films about, which never came off. But obviously when Tarka came up, he said, I'll kill you, David, if you don't let me write the treatment, the screenplay.
Bit awkward.
Yeah. So he did Henry Williamson had a go at it first, and could never write about the book at all. All the stuff that came up was about the First World War. And I think he wrote something like 100 pages altogether. No sign of an otter at all. And so I had to stop him. And anyhow, Gerald took over, and Joe took over, and did a very, very good job. Just reminded of one thing about Tarka the Otter, which is really spooky, which you may have heard of. Henry Williamson lost his mind while we were making Tarka, so he couldn't be with us at all. He was staying in a retreat.
Getting on a bit, was he?
Yeah, he was getting on a bit. But the main unit filming went on, and we had to do the finale where Deadlock has a battle with Tarka. And it was a beautiful day, and we filmed all day. We filmed the dead otter hound being pulled out of the river. We filmed the 3 bubbles disappearing down the stream, the red, blood and all that stuff. And eventually we had to stop. and the next day we had some pickup shots to do with the hounds, I think. I met Richard Williamson just as the crew were arriving and setting up, and he said, David, it's extraordinary, you won't believe this, but while you were filming those death scenes yesterday, Henry died. And it was an extraordinary coincidence really that you know, the climax of the whole story was taking place as he folded his hands across his chest and died.
Gosh. What an interesting recollection. And we're talking about cameramen. That's right. Yes. You said did you actually work with Fred Gamage?
Yes, I'm trying to think what I worked with Fred Gamage on. Fred, must have been some of those civil defence films, I'm sure. He was very good company. Never phased at all. That's lovely right, man. Yes. Lovely man. And that would all been after he'd had that accident. Very, very calm, very happy man. Never hurried.
I interviewed him for the History Project, I think, with Dave Robson, recorded, he's down at Gleeblands.
Is he?
And Doris, his wife, and
right.
But Fred is sort of invalid, and I think he's more or less, you know, in a wheelchair, mostly.
Yeah.
And he's sort of nearly 90.
Gosh.
Last of the Grand Filming cameramen.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course he was.
Because he worked with Jennings.
And Jonah Jones, of course.
And Jonah, you worked with Jonah.
I did work with Jonah, yes. On that Test Flight 263 thing. Two little bits about Jonah. We eventually, at RE Bedford, which had one of the longest runways in the world, had to put Jonah into he always used to say, "I done target."
Yes, I
that was
done
his
target.
claim to say, "I done target." Put him into a Sea Venom, I think it was, which was the only aircraft which could keep up with this Fairy Delta II, which held the airspeed record. And the idea was that as the Fairy Delta II came back, the Sea Venom would be able to fall mate on it, slightly behind, and Jonah would have a Newman Sinclair, I think it was a Newman Sinclair, he was a Newman Sinclair man, on a bracket in this side-by-side seating in that Sea Venom, and be able to film a little bit of it on its approach to the runway. And I always remember that we went and put the hose, got Jonah sitting in the aircraft with the bracket and the camera on top, and the pilot saying to Jonah, "Of course, if anything happens, Jonah, you won't be able to get out because of that effing camera and the bracket. I'll be able to get out, I'll be able to jet, you won't be able to." The other thing about Jonah told me about Coventry Cathedral, he was one of the cameramen there during the Blitz to film the aftermath, and there was the cross, which was very charred, and he said, "You won't believe this, David, but I got them to set light to the cross again because it made a better picture."
True artist.
Yes, he was a nice man. I didn't do an awful lot of work with him, but it was quite difficult.
I imagine he could be, yes.
Quite difficult.
He was chief cameraman at Crown,
Yeah.
and his father, Jones, was the looked after the camera department. He was responsible for all the gear. Yes.
Right. Right. And I think of somebody else I worked with, the Samuelsons I worked with.
Oh right, did you? Yes.
I don't know if they're still alive. Sydney must still be alive.
Yes, Sidney and David are, and the younger brother who's on the legal side, Michael. No, Michael died a couple of years ago.
Did he?
There's, what's his other brother's name? Is it Terry? But we had all three of them up for they've just done the family history from father's period, quite an expensive book, and they've come up and must be about a year ago now they were up there. It was quite an eventful lunchtime with them. But he's been an honoured member of our committee, isn't he, on and off?
Yeah,
He's done some,
yes,
he's put
of
in
course
touch
he
with
was
lots of
also-
people, you know.
He was screen commissioner, wasn't he?
Mm.
I don't know if he's still.
No,
still
he's retired from that now, but he's still doing a few bits and pieces.
Yes. When I was doing this EBU drama, Bernard's Watch, or one of them, when the screen commission had just started, he obviously came and visited Central, and he was brought out. It's probably the only thing that was being shot at the time. And I said, you probably don't remember, but I did work with you a little bit at Merton Park. We did some inserts for me once. And he said, what are you doing now? I said, we're shooting on tape. It's very different from when you and I were working together on film. And he said, there'll be no checking the gate on this, there'll be no mistakes or anything like that. And what he did, in fact, was quite extraordinary. It was a kind of curse he left, because the continuity girl, or PA, wants to check something, have a rewind, see exactly which hand somebody had done something in, and didn't rewind it, and we lost, I don't know, the whole of one scene which we had to reshoot the next day, so it's not foolproof tape. And David, of course, I worked with on some of the motorcycling films, because he was a wonderful newsreel cameraman. And I remember working with him at Hawkstone Park in near Shrewsbury, a big scramble bike ride thing. It's incredibly dry and dusty, and they all set up this hill, the big hill, and I put David at the top of the hill, and somebody skidded at the top of the hill, and he got all this happening, and he got all the other riders riding over it. In fact, they rode over and broke his leg, and there was so much dust they couldn't see this guy on the ground at all. People continued riding over him. And then he managed to get himself up in a tree, and he got somebody missing a corner and just going straight on. He was wonderful, David. Lovely man. I don't think I ever met Michael, but David was a wonderful guy.
Michael still kept doing the book for every year, the cameraman's sort of handbook for each year, right up until he died, I think, virtually,
Really?
you know.
Yeah.
No, they've recently sold their camera collection. I think they had 2 lots of everything.
Did they really?
They kept one lot they gave to the BFI, and when we closed Momi down, it was in Stormley. He just said, "What are you doing? We haven't got any plans at the moment." We said, "Well, we would like to, you know, go back," and they got quite a fair price for the cameras. Yeah.
I bet. Yeah. Where would they go? I mean, they all split up, or
split up, unfortunately, because we did have the lion's share of Momi. They were in a gallery there for various different cameras.
Yeah.
And they had a note what film they were shot on and used on, etc.
Yeah.
But I think Sydney had a couple of each camera, so probably the one they kept away and they sold the other ones off, you know, which were donated to us.
Yeah.
When you were working with Film Producers Guild, which you were with Ronnie Riley, and you must have been making films for quite a few different sponsors. You know?
Yes, I mean, there are most BP, SKC, Services Cinema Corporation, the Army ones, Home Office, Ferodo I made a film for.
Right, yeah.
Dunlop I made a film for.
I was just wondering what it's like working with so many different sponsors and comparing like with like. You know, some were obviously very good, and some were you had tight budgets, or sometimes you had difficult films officers from the different firms, or people responsible for the completion of the film.
Yeah.
They could be very difficult. I know we had that occasionally at British Rail, you know, dealing with different departments. But I was wondering whether there's sort of getting involved in that sort of thing, it could, you know, produce nightmares occasionally, particularly if you got a schedule for dubbing and they went, and after the sort of sponsor approval show, you have to make a whole lot of alterations. You know. I do
remember the first film I made for David Villiers, which was about radioactive fallout, which is an enormous undertaking. It was parts 1, 2 and 3. One of the things you had to do for the client, the Home Office, was to do a commentary read show for them. So you had cues all worked out, and I would read the voiceover. And trial run of this with David, and at the end of it he said, David, this kind of showing is the most important thing you do, and you have to be an actor when you do this. You've just been rather lackadaisical about the whole thing. You have to love what you're doing, you have to mean every word, and it's a real showpiece. You have to do it. And I learned an awful lot.
It's a presentation,
It is a presentation, yes. And I've had to pass that on to people over the years. It's absolutely crucial. You're doing the work that Duncan Cass or Vernon Greaves. Vernon Greaves is one of the great voiceover people, don't remember.
Yes, you're trying to show them that what it'd be like, the finished article would be like before it is the finished article, and it's got to. And you're showing it to the layman, and
they don't understand.
They tend to be rather hostile too at times because there's an awful lot of money being spent.
Yes, they didn't really want the film made.
Are we getting it value? Yeah.
That's right. Yes.
Did you do any work for the COI at all?
I did do a film for the COI. Two experiences. I did a film for the COI called The British Policeman with a lovely lady, Frances Cobham, who was the supervising person. And it was shot in Leicester, and it was for showing abroad, so it was very basic. It was almost biblical in the way it was done. And it was a lovely sergeant called, I can't remember what his name was now, awful. He was a lovely man, and I inquired about him recently. He's dead now. But he was demoted to police constable to play this part of the English Bobby. And it was a lovely film to do. It was shot by Johnny Wiles, I remember. And we had a scene to do where there's a call, and the policeman goes to a house which is suspected of being burgled, and he has to chase after the burglar as he runs out. And this poor guy, ripped his back running after this burglar, and we had to stop shooting for a month.
Good God!
While he got better. I wish I could remember his name. But I enjoyed doing that. And then a long time later, I was asked to do a film on what kind of situation would test young people enough to want them to go to Bramshill and become police officer as opposed to a police constable. And there's a lovely writer called Arden Winch. I don't know what's happened to him. It's the only time I worked with him.
Winch.
Yes, he did feature films and television and all sorts of stuff. I don't know if he's in any of your books, but he's a great guy. And every situation that we put these people in, it was too hot for the police to actually embrace. And I think eventually, I had nothing to do with it in the end. I think eventually we had something rather prosaic, like a road tanker overturning or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
The whole time we wanted to much more difficult problems for them to domestic violence and things like that, which are much more difficult for young people to sort out, I think, than
True, indeed, COI, they were very good. They were very good sponsors, weren't they, for so many years? You worked with the COI.
Yeah, I was with them for 5 years in the closing days of the film and TV side. But it's still there. They've still got in-house producers, but nothing like it was by any stretch of the imagination. But John helped me very much when we were doing the 50th anniversary. You got a load of people still around, weren't you? Arthur was still.
Oh, we had that big do down at the COI.
Yeah. It's quite ironic, I was made redundant the week before, but I had a nice letter from Mike Devereux, who was the chief executive, after just thanking me for getting all the people along. I said, well, really, John Ledyard got me in touch with everybody, but, John was going, there's another couple more, we'll see if we can get hold of them. I mean, we've got 2/3 out of the original people we could get hold of, who weren't away on holiday, but they were all there.
And what about working with in post-production with editors? Did you have a sort of favourite editor tried to keep as much, although you're not too worried. You know, some directors like to have their cast around them.
I've never had.
Perhaps that's more so with features and documentary. But
At the BBC, it was frowned upon to, you know, they didn't like you to get too.
yeah, I'm sure.
They didn't want you to use the same person all the time. It's a good thing to have a change around then. I was trying to think, the Film Producers Guild. I did work with Michael Barton a lot.
Oh yes.
I haven't spoken to him for a long time, but about 5 years ago I spoke to him.
And what about Charles Davies, who edited Tarka?
I only worked with him on Tarka, and then I did a series in Japan called the what's that called? In the Shadow of Fujisan. And he edited that, and I mean, that was again a terrific amount of footage you had to wade through.
Really?
A lot of it bought in from NHK and people like that.
Were you actually out in Japan when?
Oh yeah.
How long were you in Japan?
I had 5 trips, I think, altogether to Japan, and extraordinary place. One or two interesting things happened. We were told to take presents out because it's something you had to do, and my assistant bought lots of lovely little Wedgwood pots.
Oh yes, that's a nice idea.
And also little pots of Patum Paterium. And the Patum Paterium went very quickly, and we ended up in Hokkaido, the northern island, with the Ainu, the bearded Japanese, the Aboriginals. And we had one present left, and I knew it was Wedgwood, and there were 2 kinds of Wedgwood. There were kind of cigarette things, and also there were kind of things to keep powder in. And I didn't know which it was. And I was quite relieved really, because it was rude to actually open the present up in your present. So I thought it'll be all right. We'll be gone. We'll be back in Tokyo. It'll be all right. But this great big hairy Ainu guy grabbed his present when it was given to him and tore it open. And the look on his face when he saw this kind of ladies kind of thing was amazing. They're extraordinary. I mean, whaling and dolphins had a lot to do with that, because we wanted to film them killing dolphins and whales because it's you know
So just this was a sponsor.
This is BBC.
This is BBC, of course.
BBC, yes. And I knew that a place called Taiji, which is about halfway down the east coast of Japan. There were all these little inlets, and this is a fishing port. And they did drive these dolphins and little whales, pilot whales, into fjords, and then put a net around, and then chop their throats and sell them for market up in Tokyo. And we went and had lunch with the main fishy people in Taiji and said, we really want to do this. And they said, we'll let you know what's happening. We knew perfectly well they weren't going to let us know when it was going to be happening. And then quite by chance, one day we were coming back from lunch, and I saw this little flotilla of boats coming towards the shore in a kind of crescent. And we quickly got the camera set up, and we were able to film the whole thing of these wretched pilot whales and dolphins being driven into this bay, and the clicking noises, and screaming they were making as they were, getting scarred and awful on the rocks and so forth. They brought this great big net across, and they started cutting their throats, and the whole sea went red.
So how much of that was included in the final edit?
Well, amazingly, the Americans showed it all, but here, the BBC were very squeamish about it, and we had to cut quite a bit out, which I was a bit ashamed about, really. Because it's a very strong, the Japanese are so namby-pamby about whaling and all that stuff, I think. They say it's scientific evidence, that scientific information they're after, but it is. There's a market for whale meat. And quite coincidentally, a Japanese couple arrived as we were filming this, and they said, "Gosh, we're lucky today. We've seen the dolphinarium up the road where the dolphins are doing all their tricks and the pilot whales are doing stuff, and here we are. We see all this happening as well. Aren't we lucky?"
Oh, God.
See,
Completely sort of blank. So how many were in the series of these Japanese?
Three 50-minuters.
Oh, were they? Yeah.
The first one was about religion and the monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
The second one was about art and the cranes, and the third one was about the sea and fish and the international view of Japan.
And did you do the writing yourself, the narrative?
I did some of it, yes. I plotted the whole thing out, but my assistant Jo Stuart Smith did most of the writing. She wrote a book as well.
And did you have a narrative speaker? Sorry, who spoke the commentaries mainly? Did you have the same?
That was all spoken by. We were conned into this fellow, and I can't remember his name.
The great thing is you didn't have a. Nowadays, so much of commentators not only reading the commentary, but also there when the thing's being shot, so their faces constantly filling the screen, talking heads.
I hate that.
And I keep on saying, "Get out of the way! I want to look at what you're talking about."
Exactly.
We did it in a much more straightforward and direct system in the old days. Edgar Anstey was dead against having faces talking. The only time we had a face